Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It is the 30th of May, but more importantly, this is the week of build. So in this Azure Update, I'm going to try and cover all of the infrastructure related announcements that were made at Build 2021, in addition to just the regular announcements that were made this week. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment, and share is appreciated. New videos. So I created kind of a deep dive about deployment scripts, the ability to run pretty much any action from your Azure template, be it an ARM JSON or Bicep. And that was actually the only video. And it wasn't because I was being lazy, it's that normally I work all day Sunday on sort of the YouTube content. Well, I lost Sunday because I was at Ironman Tulsa. And if it makes you feel any better, it was a beating of a day. So it rained for the entire bike ride. So that was me getting wet and miserable on the bike ride. The run started out okay, but within a couple of hours, I was really questioning my life choices. This was at about mile, I think 23, but it all goes away when you actually reach the end. So I did finish. It took me 14 hours. It was a very long day, but that's why there's only one video this week. So let's get on with the new features announced around Azure. So on the compute side, a whole set of announcements around the Azure Kubernetes service. The first one is Arc has gone GA. So this is the ability to now use Azure AD users, groups, or other types of service principals as the subject for the Kubernetes kind of authorization. This avoids the need to actually go and create separate Kubernetes user identities. I just need to have enabled the managed Azure AD integration that lets my Azure AD account actually get used with Kubernetes. And then in the documentation, it goes through a whole set of how you can create the custom roles and actually use those and target kind of different namespaces, how I want those permissions to be laid out. Encryption at host has gone GA. So remember, encryption at host is all about the idea that yes, we have, for example, managed disks, and that managed disk is encrypted with a platform managed or a customer managed key. But on the host itself, we have a cache for those disks, the OS disk and the data disk, and we have temp files as well. When I turn on encryption at host, the cache of those disks is now encrypted using the same key as where it's kind of encrypted at rest, i.e. platform managed key or customer managed key. The temp disk is always encrypted with a platform managed key, and the data is securely transferred over the wire. So I can now enable that encryption at host for my Kubernetes clusters. There's this new regulated industry support. And what this basically boils down to is a collection of different things. So there's this new AKS cluster baseline for regulated workloads, kind of this reference architecture, new PCI guidance, this CIS AKS specific benchmark. So Microsoft actually worked with CIS, the Center for Internet Security, to create this AKS specific benchmark to really help get this standard set of security in place. Then of course that Azure Arc for Kubernetes feature I mentioned, FedRAMP compliance, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and that CSI secret store feature, which I actually talked about last week, that essentially lets me say, hey, my Azure Key Vault, I can mount that essentially as looks like a file system and then access the various secrets and keys in that Key Vault. Which brings us to this new FIPS compliant node. Now this is in preview. What this is going to let me do is when I create my node pool, I can do kind of this -- enable -FIPS -image. So it's a special image that basically has a set of cryptographic modules enabling me to meet that FIPS 140-2 compliancy. This is super important if I want my nodes to be FedRAMP compatible. So if I want FedRAMP compliant, hey, there's this new FIPS compliant nodes is now in preview and I can leverage that. Kubernetes 1.21 is in preview, lots of enhancements in Kubernetes 1.21. Containerd for Windows Server containers is in preview. Now, if you remember, this happened for Linux a while back. Originally, we had kind of the Moby project, which was a wrapper around Containerd that had to go through this shim, this Docker shim, to enable it to actually talk to the management plane of kind of the Kubernetes. Well, Containerd now just natively has this kind of the better option. So for Linux, that's the standard now. Now it's also available for Windows in preview. Once this Containerd goes GA, it will become the only supported container runtime. So this is kind of the first step on that path. It doesn't really make any difference to your containers you're deploying itself. It's really more of just that engine under the covers. Cluster Auto Upgrade now respects maintenance windows. So a maintenance window, I can configure if my AKS is built on VMSS, virtual machine scale sets. And I can say, hey, when you do maintenance, this is the regular window that I'm scheduling you can use. The cluster auto upgrade enables me to say, hey, based on a certain channel I specify, be it a patch, stable, rapid, etc., how aggressive I want to be, it will now auto upgrade, but only within the maintenance window I've actually specified. So I can control when it does that auto upgrade. And there's this new node pool and node view. They showed it at build. It's not lit up to actually see yet. But what it's going to do is bring together the Azure Resource Manager and the Kubernetes information. Actually, when I go and look, if I go to my resources, look at my node pools, it'll actually give me a lot more information. So they demoed that. It's not lit up just yet, next couple of days. New Logic App hosting options has gone GA. So Logic Apps are these great things that through the designer, I can kind of drag and drop sets of actions and I get this flow. It's triggered by something that I can go through these various steps. Maybe something gets written somewhere, then it goes and writes something to Teams, it goes and does something else. But it always kind of ran in its own hosting platform. What they've now done is they've built this in, so now it runs in its containerized runtime. Well, that enables me to now run it as functions, as app service, as Kubernetes, Docker. Basically now really opening up where I can use those Logic apps, really anything I have. So it gives me a lot more flexibility. PowerShell support in durable functions. So normally functions are serverless, and they're triggered by something, they do something, and they go away. But if I have some kind of long-running process, that's a problem. Maybe I have an idea where, hey, I need some kind of coordination for this longer-running set of processes. Maybe I have a chaining of different things that are executed. Maybe I have some kind of fan out where multiple things get called and then fan back in. Maybe it has to watch something, so it's watching some other process. Maybe there's waiting for human interaction. So we have the idea of durable functions that let me have kind of this coordinator and overall state that's maintained for a durable function. Well, now those durable functions can use PowerShell as well. That's GA. App Service Managed Certificates has gone GA, and these are free. So this is the idea for my Linux, for my Windows at no cost. It can be a child domain, it can be an Apex domain, i.e. the root like saviltech.net, that would be an Apex domain, or it could be www.saviltech.net, a child domain. Those certificates are now free. It will just basically click and say, I want this cert. It will manage the life cycle of it. It will manage kind of importing it in. It's a set and forget. So now I have those managed certificates just available to me within my app services. For virtual machines, not really VM features, but they were just a couple of announcements around things that really use virtual machines. So the first was the IBM WebSphere app server has gone GA. So this really lets me now migrate web server workloads to Azure virtual machines. This can be things like the WebSphere, the traditional app server, WebSphere Liberty and Open Liberty. And also Red Hat JBoss EAP has gone GA. So this is all about kind of the Enterprise Edition for Java and the Jakarta Enterprise Edition, which is that cloud native enterprise extended version of Java with things like distributed computing, things like web services. Well, now there's actually, in the gallery, I can go and deploy VMs or VM scale sets for that clustered capability if I need that horizontal scaling. Remember though, the JBoss is also available as part of an app service plan. So if I go and create an app service and say Java, I can actually use the JBoss EAP as kind of that runtime. So there's different ways I can use JBoss within Azure. And then Spot VMs for Databricks. So remember, Databricks is that optimized Apache Spark-based analytics environment. Well, Spot VMs is, hey, there's spare capacity in Azure. I can use it at a much cheaper price. So now I can actually use those Spot VMs as part of my Databricks to bring down the cost. So that's GA as well. Azure Stack. So the HCI trial has been extended to 60 days. It used to be 30 days. Remember, HCI is, I install this on my own hardware, and now I can run that free for 60 days before I have to go and register it for subscription and start paying. If it goes past that time, it will go into reduced functionality mode. I can't create new resources. I can still stop, but it's going to be in that reduced functionality mode. So it gives me more time to play around to try that out. And AKS on HCI has gone GA. So this is now this very, very easy enablement of the Kubernetes running on HCI, we've just talked about. And remember, the HCI AKS is all about the management plane, the creation of the cluster, deletion of the cluster, upgrade, those types of actions. Then on top of that, I could apply Arc for Kubernetes to then actually have the workload management, the GitOps, the monitoring. So those two things work really, really well together. But now it's very, very easy if I have HCI to just enable AKS on it. And then with Arc for Kubernetes, I can do that full lifecycle management of my actual workloads. So Azure Arc. We can now run app services anywhere. So this is kind of a super interesting thing they announced. I can now think about, well, this can run actually on AKS, so actually in Azure, the Azure Kubernetes service, or AKS on HCI, or any Arc managed Kubernetes, any CNCF compatible Kubernetes distribution, I can now deploy this onto. And it's going to give me app service, functions, logic apps, event grid, and API management. So all of these things I can actually now use on pretty much any Kubernetes environment, as long as it's CNCF compatible and it's being managed by Arc. So it could be on-prem, it could be in other cloud providers. Now, if we just super quick remember the idea of what is Arc. So we think about Azure has this great set of kind of metadata. We have great things like policy. We have great things like kind of tagging. We have RBAC. We have things like security. There's huge numbers of components. And then what Arc does is when it starts off kind of Arc for servers. So if it's Windows or Linux, hey, I can have an agent on those and they report into Arc. But then what we can do is, hey, we have kind of our own Kubernetes environment. Oh, that should be an S. We have our own Kubernetes environment. And when we light that up with Arc, so I've got Arc involved here, it uses things like Helm and Flux to have some pods on there. And those are kind of the controllers, the config, the connect capabilities. But now it's actually connected into Azure with that. Well, that gives us a whole bunch of functionality. Monitoring, container insights, policy for Kubernetes, even Defender for Kubernetes. I can now use on that Kubernetes anywhere it is, again, on-premise, other clouds, whatever. I can do GitOps. I can point it to a Git repo and it will pull down the YAML files and deploy that. But what we're now doing is, well, there were like data services. So things like the Postgres hyperscale, the SQL MI, and then machine learning would kind of build on this to add those kind of extra services. So we had the kind of data and we had the machine learning, again, Arc for those services. What we're now adding are those kind of app service. Again, it's going to sit on top of that. And there's three bundles. There's a kind of app development bundle. That's going to give me Azure Web Apps, Logic Apps, and Functions. Then there's the API Management Gateway bundle, which is API Management Gateway. And then there's the Azure Event Grid, which gives me Event Grid. So now those will be running actually on whatever Kubernetes cluster I have. So if I'm using those services, hey, yes, great, I can use them in Azure, but I can now use them in really any environment. I have a CNCF compatible cluster that's being managed by Arc for Kubernetes. So that's kind of a pretty huge thing to now see all these different services just available in so many different places. And Jumpstart ArcBox. So this is really, ArcBox is interesting. It's an ARM template. It's an ARM template that I'm going to deploy into a subscription into a resource group. And when I do that, it's this sandbox environment that opens up, I think, like 50 different or 60 different scenarios that I can play around with. We can actually jump over to it. And again, I'll have the link in here. And we can see it just, hey, it's got this Azure deploy JSON file that's going to go and pull a bunch of different things. But essentially, I would deploy this JSON file into a resource group. I answer some questions about configuration. But when it's finished, I can now run through these huge numbers of different scenarios around Azure Arc enabled servers, Kubernetes, data services, all those different things will actually just be available to me. So this is kind of a super powerful, useful thing I can actually do. So if you want to go and try it out, and you have maybe limited environments, you can do it yourself. It's pretty easy to go and deploy and get started with. And it's just one resource group, so I can easily clean it away when I'm finished. Okay, so storage. Blob inventory is in preview. Now, I think I've talked about this before, but basically what this lets me do, let's go and actually see this quickly, is I can configure, and every 24 hours, it will go and run this kind of inventory job. So if I go and look over here, if I look at my storage account, and if we scroll down, what we can actually see under data management is we see this blob inventory. So we have this option right here. Now when I configure this, what I basically do is I create a list of rules. So I turn on blob inventory, so hey look, now it's enabled, and then I create a rule. Now in my case, all I have done is I've said, look, it's a default rule. I selected all of the blob types, but you could add additional things. I could filter it to only certain prefixes. I could also include things like versions and snapshots. And what I've done on this is if I configure the policy settings, you pick a container. And this container is where it's actually going to write out this inventory. So in my case, if I go and look at my containers, I picked this inventory container. And you can see it then creates kind of this date hierarchy. This is all using virtual directories because blob is essentially flat. And what I can see is this CSV file. And if I quickly look at the CSV file, if we just download it and open it, you can see, yep, it gives me the details of the blobs I have within there. Things like creation date, last modified, type, access tier. Really just an easy way to quickly get an inventory. And like I said, it's going to go ahead and run that every 24 hours. So that is there. That's in preview. Database. Some big things on database. So PostgreSQL and MySQL flexible. So remember, this is the one that's based on virtual machines. Well, now it's part of a free account. So I think for the first year, so for 12 months, you get something like 750 hours. It's a small one. It's like a B1 MS. But I think you get like 32 gigabytes of storage. So I can now try these out at no cost in a free account. So that's coming, I think, very, very soon. PostgreSQL and MySQL Purview support. So remember, Purview is that huge kind of data governance insight into my data. And what this now means is the metadata can be sourced from Postgres and MySQL. That will let me track things like data lineage. So I can see, well, what's happened, where did it come from, what happened. I can see, well, what's consuming it, what was transformed, all from those managed databases. On Postgres Hyperscale, so remember, Hyperscale is built on Citus. And if we think about what that is ordinarily, remember, Postgres is a single box. It's a single compute with its storage. So what Citus does is it takes that Postgres and it makes it distributed. So now I can think about, I can have multiple nodes. I can really just keep scaling out, each with their own kind of premium managed disk. Yes, I have kind of this coordinator up here, and I shard my data. So I have this sharding, so I distribute it over those different nodes. So now it scales near infinitely, and it's going to perform great because it can actually run those in parallel over those different nodes. So that's what Citus is, and Hyperscale is kind of the Microsoft term for the Postgres Hyperscale that's using Citus to make Postgres distributed. So with that, they've added support for version 12 and 13 of Postgres on Hyperscale. They've added this columnar compression. Now this is interesting. So ordinarily, when we think about a database, we store data in rows. If you think about any kind of standard database, remember you have like different columns. You have column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, etc. Then you have records. And those records go across kind of in that direction, and that's how it's stored. But that's really tricky because if you think about it, the columns are completely different types of data. So the compression I get across the rows is really not great. Whereas if I think about the columns, they're all the same data type. So with this columnar, it's a single command I can run and it transfers it to this. I get fantastic compression because now it stores it by column, which is all the same data type. So I'm going to get really, really good compression. So now on that Postgres Hyperscale, I can basically run a command and it will switch to that and I'll get huge capacity savings actually on my database. And then Citus 10 support. So Citus 10 adds a whole bunch of new features. Obviously one of those is the columnar compression, but it's also got, I think, joins and foreign keys between local Postgres and Citus tables, improvements to SQL and data definition language support, simplified operations, and various other things. So all goodness. Then CosmosDB, well, its free tier is GA, but they've increased the limits. So if I go and actually look at my CosmosDB over here, what we used to get, remember, was something like 400 request units and 5 gigabytes of storage. Well, if I now go and look at my little free CosmosDB, notice up here at the top, it's telling me, hey, you're using your free one. Hey, good job. But it's saying, oh yeah, your first 1,000 RUs up from 400 and 25 gigabytes of storage up from 5 is now free. So that's kind of this always per subscription. I can pick one CosmosDB account that's free. So now I get 1,000 RUs and that 25 gigs of storage to play around with to help me learn and use those things. Serverless has gone GA. So ordinarily with CosmosDB, I use a provisioned performance request units, RUs. And I pay a certain amount, and then I have to kind of be careful that I'm consistently using it because I'm paying for them anyway. I have to be very careful how I write my queries because maybe I'm lazy with my queries, I'm not efficient, and I run out, so I get throttled. Well, serverless, there is no minimum RU. I pay for the RUs I use, I pay for the storage I consume. So this is phenomenal if I have like maybe burst workloads, infrequent workloads. Now it does have capacity limits, whereas regular CosmosDB does not. It cannot have multi-region. I can only have a single region. So there are limits on it, but there may be scenarios where, hey, I have that burst, I have this infrequency, serverless is the right option for me. Integrated cache is in public preview. So I talked about those request units. That's anytime I do operations, anytime I read from it, I'm using request units. The integrated cache enables me to have a dedicated gateway that kind of sits in front. Now it's a read through and a write through gateway, a write through cache. What will happen is for the core SQL API only, as I perform operations, it will actually cache it. So then when I perform reads in the future, it will actually use the cache if the data is populated in the cache. If it's not, it would read through and populate that cache. So it's going to save me RUs, those precious request units on the back end, but obviously I'm going to pay for that dedicated gateway. But if I have very heavy kind of read workloads, this might be a great feature to actually have. And it's kind of super easy to do. If we just look at that same CosmosDB database, if I scroll down, there's dedicated gateway. I can say, hey, I want to provision that thing. And then I set the SKU, I set the number of instances. I can go and look at the actual costs. But the whole point about this is it's going to improve that read performance and save those RUs actually on the back end. So that's kind of the whole point actually of this. Also, there's this cost optimized diagnostics. So what this enables me to do is I can have this Azure Diagnostics legacy or resource specific tables. So I can have better control over actually the data I send actually to the diagnostics. So I can actually reduce the latency, I can improve the query performance and probably save money. Always encrypted is in preview. So this has been in SQL for a while. This is the idea of client-side encryption. So on the client side, I encrypt. And then in Cosmos, it's always encrypted. It's encrypted, decrypted on the client. And just like SQL, I can do randomized or deterministic encryption, i.e. does the same value always encrypt to the same encrypted value? That's kind of that deterministic. Or would it be something different? And there's pros and cons. We've been able to perform certain actions on Cosmos if it's randomized because it can't tell if they're the same. It can make things more complicated. But if I have certain regulatory requirements, I can now do that always encrypted. So on Cosmos, the data is always encrypted. It's actually on the client side, it's doing the encryption, decryption as needed. Then Azure AD role-based access control. So now I can actually, for again, the core SQL API, I can have fine-grained controls using Azure Active Directory identities. So I can create these data plane roles. They're part of the Microsoft.Document DB database accounts. I can create the roles, give them to Azure AD service principals, and then that can actually control the access to my Cosmos DB documents. Partial document update is in preview. Ordinarily, if we update a document, i.e. kind of an entry in Cosmos DB, we go and get the full document, read, and then a full document write. So from a request unit perspective and time, that's fairly expensive. This enables me to directly update specific fields or properties in a document. So that's going to reduce the latency and again, save on the CPU, save on those request units. Then there's a Linux emulator is in preview. So just locally on my box, I can now basically run Cosmos DB. It's got a special key, connect to a local host. There's a Cosmos DB Explorer I can use. But now if I'm developing, rather than actually having to have an Azure subscription at all, I can run it all against my local, for example, my Mac OS box. I can be running this Linux-based emulator for Cosmos DB for my testing. Then once I'm finished, then I can think about actually going moving that up into an Azure-based Cosmos DB. Azure Monitor. So now for Java apps running in app service, I can now do that codeless attach. So this is this kind of single click ability to just light up app insights for my Linux or Windows based Java applications. and then it will just start giving me the information about dependencies, performance, gives me deep root cause analysis, all I want to know without having to change my code at all. So it's been there for things like .NET for a while, but now, hey, I can do that for Java as well. Click, integration with App Insights. Query packs. So hey, with Log Analytics, I write these fantastic queries, and they're typically stored within the workspace themselves. It's like, hey, I've written these fantastic queries. I want to be available across workspaces, maybe across subscriptions. So what we now have is the idea of a query pack. So if I jump over to here, what I'll actually do is a query pack is a Azure top level resource. So I can go and search for query packs, and there's Log Analytics query packs. And I've created this core pack 1. So it lives in a certain region. It lives in a certain resource group. But you can just create kind of as many as you want, super easy. Say, hey, I want to create a new one. Give it a name, and you're done. Now, once you have that, I can now actually go over to my Log Analytics workspace. I'll just pick one. I can go to my logs. And what we'll see is, if I go to my queries, for example, actually go to my query explorer. Oh, not that one, sorry. Over to here, queries. I can do select query packs. You see this option up here. Now, before I select that, let's go back to that. If I looked at things like Azure Monitor, you can see there's a whole bunch of example queries. So I have all these different queries in here for Azure Monitor. All of these just here. And there's also some ones for virtual machines. These are all kind of built in, lots and lots of them. Well, if I select query packs, say, hey, I want to add this query pack. I've kind of created this one before, but within there, I've got some additional queries. For example, I've got some for virtual machines. If I keep scrolling down, and the whole point is I could now load this in between workspaces. So if I keep going, we'll see some ones kind of I've created. I thought I had one there. Maybe somewhere else. Let's have a quick look. I know I had it in Azure Monitors. So like those ones don't have example query. Those ones I loaded in. I'm really sure I had a VM one somewhere, but I think maybe it's reorganized it. But basically the point is I can now use that pack across different Log Analytics workspaces. They're super easy to do. If I just essentially, we'll just actually pick anything. This is my query. I could actually just from here say, okay, let's close it down for a second. I want to save, and it's save as a Log Analytics query. Instead of saving to the default query pack, which is kind of the normal thing, I can uncheck that and say, actually, I want to save it to, I have to pick the resource group where I actually have my query pack. But now I could save it to my query pack. I can set things like category. I can label it. So notice I've done like database. Oh, it was database, not VMs. That's why I couldn't see it. I did database pressure, workspace information. So I can save it, and then that will be available within there. So if I went to databases, there it is. There's my database pressure. Notice there's no example query. That's actually coming from my pack. Same for the monitor. This billable workspace and find solutions in workspace are coming from my pack. They're the three that I actually created. So that's query packs, really just this ability to now create these separate resources. And because it's an Azure resource, I can do role-based access control on that. I can control who can actually leverage it. Export logs to multiple destinations. So we have the idea of this export. So as it's coming into Log Analytics through the pipeline, I could also send it to like an event hub, which is kind of pretty much real time, or I could send it to a storage account, which is kind of hourly. Well, we can only have one, and there were restrictions on that. Well, now what I can actually do is I can actually have up to 10 of these. So I can have these multiple destinations, these 10 data export rules. That gives me more flexibility, maybe work around certain storage account limits, maybe event hub limits, different destinations, all with that. And then we have insights in Azure, container insights, VM insights, storage account, insights for everything. And they're powered by Log Analytics workspaces. Well, now we have Log Analytics workspace insights, kind of who's watching the watchman. And this gives us actually different views. So it starts off with kind of a global view. So I can actually think about, let's jump over for a sec. If we go back over here, and if I go and look at Monitor, so I can start off with just Monitor. And if I go to my insights, we can see, hey, look, Log Analytics workspaces. And we'll start off just with kind of all resource groups. You can see I've got like 5 workspaces. Shows me where they are, gives me basically the retention days, the daily cap, and licensing. But I could drill down into one of those. And now what it's actually going to do is, hey, my monthly ingestion, the host sending heartbeats, inactive agents. Let's refresh that. It is in preview. There we go. I can see where's the data coming from. Okay, so I can see perf data. I did not mean to click that. Let's see if I can go back quickly. I can see the perf data, VM connections, okay, insight metrics. I can see that ingestion. There's no ingestion anomalies, so that's a good thing. More detailed usage of all of these types of data. And I can also, for example, see health. There's no errors. I can see my agents. And the other thing it kind of does sort of to show is there's the ingestion volume, but it also shows me the ingestion latency. Remember, there's kind of 2 different latencies. There's the latency from the agent to Log Analytics, and then there's the latency for actually the Log Analytics to ingest it through its pipeline so it can actually show up in queries, etc. So this gives me great insight into all of those various things as part of my Log Analytics workspace. So, miscellaneous. Azure SQL Database Ledger. So ordinarily, Microsoft actually did away with their blockchain service. But maybe I have a scenario where I'm using Azure SQL Database, but I need to make sure there's no tampering. I need to be able to prove there's no tampering for maybe audit purposes. So what this Azure SQL Database Ledger does is now it will create digests of kind of the before and the after and add it to this decentralized blockchain technology to give me absolute kind of proof that, hey, there's been no tampering of this data without me having to change my app at all. It's just doing regular SQL, but behind the scenes when I turn this on, it's now it's creating those digests, it's putting it in a blockchain to give me that proof that there hasn't been any tampering, to be able to prove and actually audit that. It's just saying I'm going to turn on a table, and then it's very easy to see if there's been any kind of malicious altering of the data, and I could always then restore it back to the original form. It's using the same cryptographic patterns you see in blockchain technologies. It's doing that cryptographic hash of every transaction, putting it in a blockchain data structure. It's just, I don't have to do anything. Now I could store that actually in things like immutable blob storage or the Azure Confidential Ledger for the actual digest. So in preview. Azure Security Center now has GitHub Actions integration. So there's this whole push about shifting left. The idea that, hey, the checks I should perform, rather than wait until everything's finished and it's being deployed, let's actually look at things while it's in the pipeline before it's even written to a container registry, for example. So this is all about bringing in that ability to perform, hey, scanning of the images before it's even sent to a container registry. And so Azure Security Center will now give me recommendations to say, hey, look, there are workflows that are pushing to a repo that don't have this scanning in, and will actually help me configure that and make sure I'm running to best practices. Bicep 0.4 is coming in the next couple of days. A number of key things. A big one is the Bicep linter. So remember, a linter is a tool that analyzes code. It's looking for errors, stylistic errors, strange constructs, really helping me capture bad code. So it's going to have a core set of best practices. It's going to be customizable so they can be enhanced with new rules over time from the Bicep team or even other people. There's going to be new resource snippets and resource scaffolding. So when I create something, it will automatically kind of lay out all of the core attributes that I need to be able to create it. And they're really going to make this big push to have all of the Bicep samples put into the ARM template quick start get repo. There's now PowerShell for Azure Sentinel. So that's just this AZ Security Insights is available. Again, I'll have the link down there. It's the PowerShell gallery. Azure AD, Continual Access Evaluation and Authentication Context, both in preview. Now, I've talked about both of these before. Remember, the whole point of this continual access evaluation is ordinarily, remember, I have kind of my machine, and I can think about, hey, there's kind of Azure AD, and then there's some kind of resource provider. Could be Exchange Online, whatever. And what actually happens ordinarily is after I've authenticated, I get kind of sent an access token. I get a refresh token as well. But the access token is kind of typically 1 hour, so it's short-lived, and I give that to the resource I'm accessing. And the reason it's short-lived is ordinarily there's no way to revoke it. There's no way to cancel that. So they're short-lived, so that every hour I have to go and check back. I use my refresh token to get a new access token. When I get the new access token, it does checks, make sure my account's still active, make sure nothing has changed, and it will give me a new access token. So what continual access evaluation lets me do is now this resource provider can actually talk to the identity provider. Now, one purpose for this could be, hey, I'm going to sign up for events. So you can imagine I could have a longer token. Maybe it's now a 4-hour token, whatever that is. But if my account was, for example, terminated, I give it my access token, but it gets sent an event saying, no, something's happened, this has been revoked or terminated, something's happened. It would refuse the access token and make me go and get a new one. Other scenarios include, well, I can also be actually sent policy. So now it knows maybe locations I'm allowed to actually use things. I got my access token when I was sitting in a certain location. Well, then I went and took my machine, and now I'm sitting over here instead. I've still got my access token, but now because it knows the policy and the policy said, hey, locations you can use, when I try and give it that access token, it's going to say, no, I'm not accepting this, go and get a new one, which will then make me go back. Maybe it now would make me go and do MFA or something different to now get a token based, hey, my location has changed. So continual access evaluation is super powerful to really let me respond quicker as a resource provider if various things happen. Now, the other thing is authentication context. And we're used to the idea of conditional access, and normally I might have a conditional access per app. But maybe that app has different levels of sensitivity data, maybe different types of operations. So one conditional access policy really isn't enough. I want to be able to do something different if maybe I'm trying to access a different portion of data on that service. So authentication context let me actually basically create an authentication context, which is nothing more than a label. And we can actually see this. So let's jump over. Excuse me. So if I go and look at my Azure AD, for example, if I could find my Azure AD, there we go. So in my Azure AD, I'll go to my security. And notice you can see that at continuous access evaluation over here, I can enable the preview, I could select users, etc. But I'm going to go to conditional access. Now we have authentication context. Now, again, an authentication context is really nothing more than a label. That's it. On its own, it's a label. So I could create a new context. It's just a name and a description. And I'm going to publish it. So apps can now say, hey, I want this authentication context. So SharePoint Online could say, hey, for this sensitive data, I want to see an authentication context of strong authentication. Now, I can only have a limited number of these, so I would not create them app specific. I would create them based around key conditions like strong authentication or this location, because I can't have 20 per app. I'm going to run out. But I create one for strong auth. And again, it's just a label. But then you go and create a new conditional access policy. And instead of targeting an application like you normally would, well, I'm going to target an authentication context. And I'm saying I'm going to target strong authentication. Then in my grant, I could say, hey, require MFA. So that now links. So when the application says, hey, I want the strong auth authentication context, it will only get that if I have passed this conditional access policy that I have linked to that authentication context. So that's really all it is. It's really just that idea that, hey, yes, I have kind of that authentication context, which is nothing more really than a label. Then I create a conditional access policy that is targeting that label. And then I have my conditions, for example, MFA. Then I can have my app say, hey, for this maybe sensitive data, I want this authentication context, which will mean, hey, I have to meet that policy that is tied to it. And only then will I actually get the access. So that's what the authentication context is all about. And that is it. Obviously, it was a lot to build, and they released a few other things as well that I've covered in this. I really hope that was useful. Please make sure you subscribe. I've got a new poll in the community section. I'm trying to find out what's the best time to do another Ask Me Anything session. But that is it. Until next time, take care.